speaker for this semester.
Well, we have one more.
Oh.
Okay, sorry. The last.
Sorry for the misinformation.
It's I totally
Okay. Want to remind you, we've got one more speaker this semester. And then after that, the poster session. Okay, to put that on your calendar. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Reed Goodman, who's an assistant professor of environmental social science at the Baruch Institute of Coastal Ecology and Forest Science. Dr. Goodman got his PhD in archaeology from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's in anthropology from Penn State, and served as a postdoctoral fellow at NYU's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. As a geoarchaeologist and cultural ecologist, his research explores how societies have interacted with coastal and estuarine landscapes over deep time, from the ancient Middle East to South Carolina's historical coastlines, where he's currently working with tidal rice agriculture as part of a long-term interdisciplinary study of the Santee Pee Delta, the Low Country's most extensive river delta system. So today Reed's going to talk about insights from his ongoing work near Basra in southern Iraq, examining the historical roots and contemporary environmental challenges of date palm agriculture and urban resilience along the Persian Gulf's highly dynamic coastline. So please welcome me in joining Reed as he talks about A Date with Destiny, palm gardens, land tenure, and the foundations of complex society in Mesopotamia.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today. And I just want to thank Daisy for organizing this and Dr. Barrett for the invite. I am very, very excited to be here. What I'd like to talk to you about, in short, is the role of date palm agriculture and agroforestry in a place like Iraq generally, but permaculture in a tidal estuary in particular, how those factors underpinned some of the earliest and longest lived urban societies in the ancient world.
Now it should, now they've clicked on it. Should be good, yeah.
Is there a way to do this just so I can see the next slide?
No.
We don't have the capability in this room, sorry.
That's all right. So when we think about ancient urban societies, places like Egypt, the Indus, China, what we often think about are serial monoculture states. And these places are often associated with challenges like nutritional deficits, but even translating that to society and social structures, things like hierarchies and tyrannical governments, because grains are visible, they're taxable, and they can be intensified even if doing so ultimately makes for a much more fragile agro ecosystem. And today, I'm going to propose a very different idea of how, in at least one example, these first cities in Sumer began. So just to bring everybody, get everybody on the same page of the where, what, and when of Mesopotamia. Sumer is this place here in southern Iraq, was a place in southern Iraq. It's part of a broader cultural scene known as ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. And the traditional story there is that these early urban sites and societies were fed by wheat and barley by the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And therefore they were a floodplain civilization built around extensive irrigation agriculture. So the research that I've been doing with a big team of scholars over the last few years has been looking at the reconstructing the paleo environment through a variety of archaeological science and geoscience techniques. And I'm going to present this model to you that instead of an arid floodplain environment, these first cities were not built on wheat and barley, but on date palm agroforestry. And the reason for that is that they had access to a tidal estuary, not unlike lowland South Carolina today. And because of deltaic morphodynamics, or sort of natural delta processes that build out a coastline, they lost access to those tides. And that had a dramatic consequence for the resiliency of these early urban systems. And I'm going to focus specifically on date palm agroforestry because of the unique, opportunities and requirements that date palm agroforestry sort of requires, and how that relates to institutions like land tenure, the coming together and permanence of these really big communities, as well as the creation of economies of scale, for example, variety and craft industries. And again, how that fed into supporting extremely large populations for extensive periods of time. And then I'll kind of move back to that paleoenvironmental data, explain how that landscape changed, why only after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, the focus became increasingly on wheat and barley agriculture, and that ultimately that situation led to the collapse of these early urban systems. And then I'll finish by tying this together, both for today, the challenges Iraq faces, but also how we might think about what we can learn from this story and apply it here in South Carolina. So again, just to get us situated, I want to bring everybody's attention to this period in the box on the timeline. So terms like Sumer, it's really a cultural term encompassing both the physical thing on the landscape, but also a culture, a period of time that represents the earliest coming together of large settlements. This is a digital reconstruction, but as you'll see, this is a sort of archetypical Sumerian city. You have monumental architecture, walls, dense habitation within those big outer walls, and beyond fields of green, which is where presumably there would have been extensive grain agriculture. And as you can see, compared to some of these earlier other urban civilizations, such as the Indus and Egypt, not only did Sumer start sooner, but continued much longer. And so when I'm talking about resiliency, how I'm defining it for you today is ultimately the persistence of these settlements to endure in a very dynamic and ultimately challenging environment, right? Because of Iraq's setting, and I'll discuss that shortly. I'm not sure how familiar people here are with a term like the urban revolution. This is something, a concept introduced by V. Gordon Childe in the 1950s. And it's sort of no coincidence that this is the same time that these cities were being excavated by big undertakings, backed by deep-pocketed donors interested in the land of the Bible. Because of course, this region that you see here shaded on the right is the heartland or the core of Sumer, and sites like Ur and Uruk are mentioned in the Bible. Ur is the birthplace of Abraham. Uruk is typically associated with the first city. It's certainly the largest city, probably the longest lived, and it had it was the political center of Sumer. I'm going to specifically speak to you about the settlements of Ur and Lagash, because in antiquity or far in the past, those represented two different sides of the Mesopotamian delta, right? So the Euphrates flows on your left here, the Tigris flows through on the right, and these rivers have moved apart over time, but in the past, they fed two different sides of the alluvium. And the other thing I want to mention is that when we think of the urban revolution, we often think about characteristics. It describes what a city was in the past, right? So again, you had monumental architecture, you had high arts and literature and science. You had a political elite. You had specialized workforce and labor that was freed up presumably by the cereal grains that were coming in and supporting very large population numbers. And the point there is that, whatever a city might be, it was a place where there was a lot of people. But that tells us what characterizes a city, but it doesn't tell us sort of the drivers of a city, what brings together these people and what supports them. Especially because we have no archaeological or textual evidence for large-scale, extensive irrigation agriculture until thousands of years after this really early period. Go back to that chronological chart, these first cities are coming online about 5,500, 5,000 years ago again. And so we don't actually have evidence for large-scale grain agriculture supported by the rivers for much, much later. And that presents a really important question. But before we get there, the question is why, right? So when people were excavating these places, it's not that, especially then, they're bringing up evidence of past grain usages and how they factored into different sectors of society. They relied as classically trained scholars of the day, and that's sort of what drove the early archaeology on sources like Herodotus. But one thing you learn when you start to study the classics is that you should never trust, or at least take the word of old dudes with beards, because they're often wrong. He never, although you should also never, never trust the Greek bearing gifts. I'm not Greek, they're dates. And if you take anything else away from today, it's that they're delicious. What do you tell yourself? Right here. No, they really are. So Herodotus is writing in the middle of the first, around 400, 300 BC, long after these cities rose and fell. Never been to Mesopotamia himself, and he talked about Mesopotamia being the breadbasket of the ancient world. Well, he was wrong, and I will sort of, even though I just said you shouldn't trust old men that try to base the rights and wrongs of the world and Western civilization to ancient Greece, when you had Greek travelers come to Mesopotamia later, people like Strabo, what they talk about or what they see is not fields of grain, but the ubiquity of dates. I'll come back to that shortly. But let me just start here by laying out the environmental context of this region. So there's a lot on this map. Use my pointer. So, oops. Again, here's the heartland of ancient Sumer. You have these are the Zagros Mountains here towards the east, very high mountain range, tectonically active. They follow through modern day Turkey and the Taurus Mountains. And here's the Arabian Plateau, which is slightly elevated. And this sort of what I consider a bathtub here in the middle is this low-lying alluvial floodplain that is transected again by these two rivers. However, because it is so lying, it's on the one hand, it's very easy to irrigate crops by natural gravity flow. The rivers rise above the floodplain, build levees, you cut through the levees, and you bring water onto your fields. However, it is a very arid region, and the mineral load of those rivers have high salt contents, and so they're very prone to the soils are very prone to salinization, and you see that here. These are Solonchak or very salty soils, and again, this is where these first cities arose, though. These two graphs that you see here, the slope of the Tigris and the slope of the Euphrates, when we talk about the heartland of ancient Sumer, we're talking about this region here around Nasiriyah or Amara. There is not anything going on that you see in the past, but the modern landscape, there's a zone of tidal effect near the modern coastline of the Persian Gulf around cities like Basra and Qasr. And that tidal effect, and I'll discuss shortly what that actually means for agroecology and agricultural production, reaches even under modern conditions. And you have to remember there's much less fresh water coming down the Tigris and the Euphrates today than there had been in the past because of upstream damming and diversion. Still reaches from anywhere from 150 to 200 kilometers inland, but that will actually have an effect on the rivers I'll explain to you what that actually means. So again, this is a very semi-arid region. This area of these early cities is beneath the 200 millimeter ISO yet, so that's typically what you would need for rain-fed agriculture. So you cannot have sustainable cereal fields without irrigation again. And the problem with that though is that the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are highly unreliable, had been in the past and are also today. And critically, the timing of the increased flow of those rivers where they are, where it's easy to tap into the levees and irrigate your fields, come at the worst time of the year. In April and May, right around the time of harvest, threatening your harvest to flood your fields. And on the other side of things, when you're sowing your fields, the water is at its lowest. And so before industrialization and water lifting, mechanized water lifting devices, it has always been a real struggle to utilize these rivers as sources. And for that reason, Iraq, at least in the ethnographic and modern present, has always been a place of tribal groups or bigger corporate political entities, because being an individual landowner is simply too risky. You have a bad year, you lose everything. It's boom and bust. Except as we get farther towards the modern coastline around those cities of Basra and Qasr, you have what is called the Shatt al-Arab Delta, or the Shatt al-Arab estuary, and you have these mesotidal conditions. And again, this figure represents modern conditions. In the past, you would have had an even higher range, but you're looking at up to 4 meters of tidal amplitude twice daily, right? So these mesotidal conditions are very similar to, for example, the PD and Santee complex here in South Carolina. This is an extraordinary, or at least it had been an extraordinary place. Okay, this is a data set from FAO, and I just want to show you very briefly. Before this period in 1975, the Shatt al-Arab estuary, again, along the Iraq's modern coastline, was the largest center of date production in the world, and certainly regionally. It fell down after 1980 because that's where you have the Iran-Iraq War. Those trees were purposefully cut, and that's a problem because of how long it takes for date palms to grow and become productive. And at the same time, again, you have less water, fresh water coming down those rivers. But it was an exceedingly productive place. This isn't your traditional bustan or oasis agriculture, where you have sort of limited spot of land where you have some palm trees that may be intercropped. This is incredibly dense, incredibly productive from a sort of nutrient perspective. And so clearly, these are the types of systems that could support high populations in the past. And this is not news to anybody in this room or online right now, but agroforestry, particular date palm permaculture, is a much more resilient approach to the land, right? So if you think about all the different plants that you can intercrop. In the past, we have textual evidence, of course, that discuss not henna, citrus, and alfalfa, but they're growing wheat, barley, onions, with other fruit crops. But that is important, again, not from just a nutritional perspective, but that produces a lot of opportunities for craft specialization or various smaller industries to build a really robust sort of workforce and substructure of any civilization or complex society. And wheat monoculture, again, places like Iraq is now practiced because you have mechanized systems that make it possible, but they are often subject to failure, increasingly so. And we see that today where you have, in fact, very little agriculture in the countryside at all, and the modern cities are overwhelmed. So what makes the Shatt al-Arab estuary in the modern period so unique and so productive? Here you can see this is an old postcard. This region was called the Venice of the East. This is roughly where this lines up in the ancient world, or in this early period that I'm talking about. And I want to bring your attention to these dots. There's a question mark there, early coastline. Because the question, of course, is how did that coastline shift in the past? But nevertheless, today, you have this mesotidal estuary. Okay, what does that mean, and why is this a great opportunity for practicing permaculture? Well, salt water flows into these tidal rivers because salt water is heavier than fresh water, flows beneath the fresh water and lifts it up. And again, when you're in such a flat landscape, and this is alluvium, it's clay, it's fine grained, you can easily tap into those banks, bring water onto your fields, bringing fresh nutrients, giving yourself the water that you need, and then you drain it at the end of the day. And why that's really critical, besides being able to manage your hydro period, your growing period, extend growing seasons, or at least contour them around the way that you want to target the crops that you're growing, it also flushes salts. And that is so important, again, in a place like Southern Iraq, because if you go there today, it actually, much of that landscape looks like fields of snow. It's white. It's just all of this gypsum sitting atop the soils. And tidal estuaries are extremely productive. There's an incredible biodiversity. And one of the arguments for why tidal regions around the world supported early civilizations, and there's a nice comparative literature to draw on there, is that they buffer risk. Again, you may have a failure of one crop, but you still have options. And if you can buffer risk, you can experiment and you can innovate. And so that creates a situation, I would argue, like the original Silicon Valley of the past. And it also allows people to cooperate, right? So the production value of these systems can be scaled. Your limiting factor generally, at least in this environment, is labor. And so it's this sort of synergistic effect through time. This image you see on the lower left, again, this is around this Sumerian core, the Sumerian heartland. As you see, it's very arid. They're losing more and more water by the day, unfortunately. And this is in stark contrast to the image you see here on the right. And that leaves the question, how do you get something of nothing? And not just something, but these really extraordinary cities, incredible advancements, again, in arts and sciences. The first writing systems appear now. If it's like this today, and was it still like that in the past? And so what did they have to do to make that possible? Or maybe it was different. Okay, so here's my first aim. I'm going to talk to you about the paleoenvironmental context. And so, yes, I'm an archaeologist, but I'm really a geoarchaeologist. So I study environmental change as close to or on top of like archaeological sites as possible, because I want to relate paleoenvironmental changes to changes in the anthropological or the human record and the cultural record. So this box here represents that Sumerian heartland, and scholars for a long time knew that sea level rose and fell in the Gulf. Why? Because the Gulf is such a shallow basin, 30 meters really at its deepest. And as you saw in that elevation figure earlier, by the time you get south of the Sumerian heartland today, you're basically at sea level. And sea level was a little bit higher in the Middle Holocene. The question though has always been how far inland had it reached, and what was the timing of that mid-Holocene sea level rise and fall in relation to archaeological sites. So to set out and answer that question, as I mentioned earlier, I've been working at the sites and sort of immediate hinterlands of a place like Or and a place like Lagash. Lagash, you do see this is a seasonal wetland. It's even for such a low-lying landscape, it's especially low here. And this was a rice region up until about 40 years ago when things just got too salty. You can see the salt efflorescences in fact on those fields. And again, I wanted to do this because I wanted to look at both the Tigris and the Euphrates and how they changed in response to sea level rise over time. Before we had really good scientific data to talk about landscape change, people relied on ancient texts. So cuneiform, wedge-shaped is what that means, was invented in this area. They wrote on clay tablets, right? So there's lots of clay, lots of reeds. It's funny that that's my name and I work here, but whatever. And so they talked about things, they make references, not specific, it's not the types of historical records we have in more recent historical periods, but they make mention of places like the sea. So you see terms, the lower sea, gu is, it just means the mouth, so the mouth of the sea. Here's Lagash. Lagash, it was next to, according to this text, an incredibly fertile region and well-watered known as the Gu Edina. So Edina is where we get the term Eden from. It ultimately comes into the Bible as a paradisical place. I don't think that argument today that really was specifically because of tides. But we have this, what is ultimately a sort of cartoonish rendering of a really important place in time and history. And it's important to suss out, how valid this is. Because it's often that in these early texts, people are not necessarily being honest, right? They're full of boasts and all sorts of misinformation. So specifically, how did we approach reconstructing this environment and tying it to the archaeological record? As I said, we went to the sites themselves. So the other part of this too is that deltaic regions, especially floodplains like in Iraq, preserve great signatures of paleo-environmental change. So we did trenching, and you can see this, what I like to think of as like rainbow stratigraphy, basically, where you have silt from an ancient river, period of drying. This is a marsh, Islamic period marsh. We dated this, in fact, and then you have modern floodplain above that. That ziggurat that you see in the back here is from, again, site of 4. This is a drilling rig that we had at Lagash. We call that thing Satan, because it almost killed a few of us. This one worked out a lot better. And I just want to give you a sort of aerial sense again, an extremely, extremely flat land. One that does not look like, it doesn't look like the Eden we would think about when we hear that term today. And this is just the location of this one site. And we did a number of drill sites, a number of auger sites on and off sites at Lagash and But I want to focus on this for a matter of time, but also, this broadly represents change that holds true for the entire region. And what were the proxies we're looking for and finding in these sediment cores? Things that are, again, very speak to very specific environments. So these Cerithium are range from marine to brackish. Gypsum, especially these large halites, speak to these really arid conditions where you have high evaporative rates. Pleistocene gravels, we find those because the rivers were moving differently then and could actually push heavy material. We have great flood events preserved, and maybe one of my favorites, that's a nice transgressional surface there where we had floodplain before we had estuary. We had estuary moved to floodplain. So in addition to the sort of physical stuff and biofauna descriptions, we use some chemostratigraphic methods like X-ray fluorescence. That's an X-ray fluorescence core scanner. You take these cores, it's really wonderful. It's like putting your luggage on a conveyor belt at the airport. You send it through, and you get great semi-quantitative elemental information. And this graph I'm going to show you, this relates just to that core at Lagash. It was a 25-meter core, and that is important because it captured a full transition from late Pleistocene through the present, right? And so that's really going to give us the signals that we want to look for. And because it's on the archaeological site of Lagash, we can tie that nicely into the human dimensions of the changes that we're evaluating. Up at the top here, you see total organic carbon, the fauna, such as ostracods and forans, again, which are really sensitive to environmental shifts. We were looking at bromine, without using X-ray fluorescence because bromine is often enriched with marine organic matter. Gypsum and sulfur are nice indicators of aridity. And and here is our age model, and that's built on a variety of processes like radiocarbon, of organic peat layers, but also shell, as well as OSL dating, or optically stimulated luminescence dating, which allows you to determine when a quartz grain was last exposed to sunlight. It's a broader chronological range, not as tight as radiocarbon, but it's good enough at the scale that we're concerned with here. So what we find at the bottom here, this is late Pleistocene, early Holocene, when the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers were deeply incised before they were building out a delta. You have an arid floodplain. You can see, for example, high rates of gypsum. And that's where we also found those gravels because the rivers were bringing down a lot of water and they're moving a lot of material. This is before you have anybody living in this region, right? Because the water table is super low, it's otherwise very salty. And so at best, people are traveling on their way to other places. Oops. As we move up, and you have to keep in mind now that this is at a period of time when the Persian Gulf is rising, the rivers start to abrade and build up onto the floodplain until you actually start to have a marine incursion. And that is most clearly indicated by, I would say, two proxies, at least from what I'm showing you here. And those are the forams and an increase in bromine. And so what we can actually see is before Lagash became an archaeological site, first it was underwater, and then it was ultimately a tidal shoal. And as we get into this zone, it's this transition is when we have urbanization, broadly in Mesopotamia, but specifically also at Lagash. And it's quite rapid. That city in particular, Lagash, was nothing, and then it was suddenly something. And that's based on archaeological work that's happening right now in the region. And so the idea there is that there are these communities coming in and making use of a very rich tidal zone. And if we put that core into the context of the broader region, and so these are lithological logs of other sediment cores primarily taken by Iraqi geoscientists from the 70s and 80s. So we translated that data into a sort of comparable sense with our core dates. You can see, and this is a cross section. So we have modern day Baghdad around here. Here is Basra. This is this Sumerian heartland core region. The blue represents a marine estuarine deltaic environment. You have peats and green and gypsums again. And so what you see overall, like we'd seen in the core earlier, is in this early period during the late Pleistocene, you have a lot of sand, a lot of coarse grains, again, being moved by these rivers that are coming down during a climatic optimum wet period. And then we have a marine incursion based on our data that lasts for about 1,500 years or so. And then we have a transition to the modern day floodplain. Okay, so what does that actually mean though for the people? Like, why does this matter from a sort of more anthropological perspective? Well, I'm going to argue based on some artifactual and textual data that date palms really made a difference here. And what's different about date palms than cereal agriculture that might have a push effect on a social institution like urbanism? Well, first and foremost, date palms are not, they take a long time to produce, right? So about 6 years until you'll get any fruit at all, about 16 years for you to get optimal production, and they can continue to produce for up to 60, 70 years, if not more. And that means that they fix people and communities in place, right? And so that's really interesting. for sort of urban settlement perspective. But they also create these really unique and important niche microenvironments in a semi-arid setting, right? You have these canopies. Shade palms, adults can reach 30 meters in height, and they introduce a lot of shade and a sort of increased ambient moisture environment where you can grow crops like wheat and barley, onion, and on and on. There's also a big attractor for wildlife, and so it's just a very biodiverse system. They're salt tolerant, right? So important in this region. But with that, the less salt, the higher productivity. So there is that. And they also offer lots of usable materials. I mentioned earlier about the relationship to supporting craft industries. And you can control, when grown in a tidal zone, the hydro period, which is, when you choose to flood and drain those fields. And so again, it's really a question of labor, not technique, that can make this incredibly productive. And I showed you that graph earlier, how productive this system was in the modern tidal estuary farther south. This is just to kind of remind us of the order of magnitude difference that growing, not just or practicing date agroforestry, date permaculture in an arid setting, but particularly in a tidal region. There are also, you can control dates in ways you cannot control wheat and barley. So they're dioecious, and it's much better to, rather than by seed, plant a date palm offshoot that grows along their trunks. Because if you have a good producer, you're going to get that same quality from a selected offshoot. I mentioned how it takes a little while for these things to get going. Well, once they do, they're cruising. But that, I would also just like to say, create an opportunity for people that want to come in and, for example, destroy your economic basis, right? If you take out a crop tree, it takes a really long time to recover rather than just wiping out a field of barley. But that means you also need to think about things like fortification. Again, just trying to push that idea of fixing communities in place through time, bringing a lot of people together, and compelling sort of innovative innovations in society. And most importantly, we have archaeological evidence for this happening as soon as we have cities. We'll bring you through that now. This is from a little bit later in time. This is Stele of Hammurabi. So this is about 4000 BP. If you want BC, tell me. I'm always confusing myself translating to different communities, but what you see in the Stele of Hammurabi at this later period, this is a time when the valuation of date palm fields are much higher than wheat and barley. And the reason for that, and we'll come to that, the environment is changing, and there's increasing sort of focus on finding suitable lands. But there's a real sense of institutions of land tenure around these things, because again, because of how long it takes these crops to produce, you end up having this sort of codification of ideas around private versus public property. I mentioned that they provide a lot of products. Mesopotamia, southern Iraq, is a land rich in clay, is a land rich in reeds, and it doesn't have much else. There's no natural stone. There, for a long time, people thought there was not much timber, but much earlier that might have been the case. But ultimately, you're really not. You don't have access to a lot of natural resources outside of the estuarine zone themselves. But these trees, again, they're 30 meters tall. They're great for structural materials. They're very nutritious. So, as you'll find out, dates have a high caloric value, but they also have a sort of range of minerals and even small amounts of proteins and fats. So you couple that with not the camel, because camel milk and the date are like the staple of the Bedouin population. And scientists infamously remark that it's all you need. This is a period before you have camels introduced to the region, but you do have sheep and you do have goats. So you have a really well-rounded diet if you have milk and cheese and meats. They're great for fuel. So the wood itself burns really well, but even the date pits. So that site at Lagash in the excavations, we have these masses of kilns where they're just firing lots and lots of pottery, and what they're using for fuel are date pits. We find them charred, and then we find them preserved, not charred, so they're probably eating them and throwing them into their fire, and some of them too, they're just tossing aside. And probably the most underappreciated fact is in the ancient world, a source of sweetness. It's so easy for us today, especially me, to find, not be sort of wowed by a lack of something like a date. And these were used, they were pressed to make syrups and pastes. And dates are also really great because of their high sugar content that they preserve even in an environment like this, and so they can be transferred and all of that. But really, this is your only source of sweetness. Yeah, you have honey specifically in the Zagros region, those mountains, but that's ancient Elam, and the lowlanders and the highlanders never got along. So you wanted to stay away from the mountains if possible. And so again, they were an incredibly important source of sweetness. So how can I convince you that date palms were really important to these first cities? Well, in terms of where they were first domesticated, the jury is out on this a little bit, but the idea is that they really got their start in a region of what is today the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, Bahrain. They would have moved over into Iran, which is there's some incredible date growing regions to this very day. But ultimately, they got their start here, and these yellow dots represent the first sort of archaeobotanical evidence of the sort of use of dates. And you do see this here. This one at a site called Tel Wayli is in Sumer, southern Iraq. But these early communities, so this is the Ubaid culture that turns into the Uruk culture of Sumer, began here, far south, along the shallow western coast of the Gulf, and they moved north. We know that archaeologically, this ceramic impression with a bitumen piece of artwork on it shows they had large double mast vessels. And again, from a very early period, 6,000 years ago, these sites, which is the heartland of date domestication and movement, these communities, these cultures moved with the rising seas of the Gulf farther north. So here is an example of Uruk, one of the first cities in Iraq, certainly the largest. This is its ziggurat. And this site's important for so many reasons, but this is where we find evidence for the first written historical records from about 5,100 to 5,000 years ago. And you might think, oh, what do you see? The Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Gilgamesh is associated with Uruk. One of the lines in that so great is that 1/3 of the city is comprised of date orchards, but that is a much later literary tradition, probably borrowing on reality, but we don't get that for another 600 years. On this tablet are lists of forests, trees and tree products, and even mentioning Magan, which is that ancient area of the UAE, relations and trade with that. But these first texts are about agroforestry. They're not about, conquests of kings and queens, or even about monitoring labor for, again, cereal culture. It is about fruit trees and their products. And so if we zoom in on this tablet and you start to look at these signs, what you see is these glyphs or iconography of not just the date tree itself, but of various products, including the offshoots. And the offshoots, as I said earlier, are really what you're going to use to propagate date palms and curate fields so that you have more females than males, and then you're maximizing production as much as possible. And so clearly, if we have this on that list from 5,000 years ago, they're intimately aware of the agrobiology of date palms and date palm production. I'm going to show you a few sort of keystone artifacts from this site and from this period. And it's not because I'm just showing you the ones that have to do with date palms and not showing you the ones that have to do with barley and grain. I mean, this is what we have. And these are sort of infamously associated with these sites. This is the Uruk vase. It's a limestone vase that was found near the ziggurat at that site. forever, archaeologists thought, oh, still today, they see these different registers as sort of a representation of society and what's most important to society at that time. And so on the bottom, you see flowing water. On the bottom, you see flowing water. You have some crops. Above that, you have your ungulates, your animals. Then you have these labor that are processionally bringing the sort of usufructive produce of these two registers up to the very top of society, where you see this presentation scene. This individual is commonly thought to be Inanna, the Lady of Heaven, one of the highest deities in the Sumerian pantheon. But what's great, or in my opinion, recently this has been reinterpreted. So again, scholars have thought that this was barley and flax right here. But a few years back, proper botanists got to take a look at this thing. And that's, again, why it's so cool and to be as interdisciplinary as possible when it comes to archaeology in the ancient world. We're a borrowing science, but we do the best work when we work in broader teams and bring in knowledge from outside. So there's a person that I used to work with in Philadelphia, Dr. Naomi Miller, and she said, you know what? This isn't barley and flax. This is date palm offshoot and flax. And so if we can take that at its value and see that this is truly representative of the fundament of these early complex communities, clearly date palms were integral. They're associated with, above all else, fertility. This is Inanna again. She's holding a staff that can use to pollinate female date palms, and you see these various representations through time associated with, again, fertility, but ultimately through the propagation of date palms and fruit production. This sign on the top here is the Digner sign. That's the sign of divinity and would remain so for thousands of years after this time period. Today, scholars have often just thought that that represents a star because everybody's, of course, wowed with the celestial sphere and relate that to heaven. But cuneiformists, the people that actually study these things, say, you know what, no, it's such a flat, low-lying landscape. Your heaven is your date palm, right? Because it truly does stand out against all else. And again, so Inanna, the Lady of Heaven, they argue is not the Lady of Heaven, but ladies of the date, the Lady of the date cluster. Also associated with kingship, right? Figures like Gilgamesh, the classic sign of rulership in Mesopotamia was the mace. And this is from Uruk. And what do we have? Nothing other than your date palm or offshoots, along with other sort of amphibious plants in a watery environment. The imagery continues on and on. These are cylinder seals, impressions, but we see, again, the mixing of rulership, fertility, and date palm propagation. And if you don't believe me, this is from about 800 years after that period. This is a cuneiform text found at the city of Umma in that red circle up here. Scholars have forever not made any sense of why they're measuring water levels twice daily over an 11-day period until some people came along very recently and said, well, we have a tidal estuary at this latitude at that time. Well, they're doing it because they're paying very close attention to the tidal rise and fall of these freshwater rivers. This is from a period of time where the coast has moved. I'm going to quickly talk about that. And so your amplitude is much less. But again, it shows that it was not only present because this is just the physiographic conditions of the area, but they're actually paying attention and using it to grow, to water their crops. This is a very complicated visual. And so I want to just highlight the most important parts. This is a digital elevation model based on Copernicus data. And all of these colors are simply an interferometric interpretation of that elevation data. And the reason for that is because the topography is so flat, you really want to see change and the development of these levees through time. It helps sort of pop those landforms out. And so here are the development of the Euphrates. These are these ridges through time. As the rate in sea level rise slowed down, the delta and the coastline began to outpace that rise in sea level and build the landscape out closer towards the coast. But regionally, you see these elevations. So in this region here, that's this figure here, you have another deltaic fan coming down from the Zagros Mountains, and the Karun and the Parque River. And that started building out quite early because this is the region where you get the domestication of not just, especially animals, and there's lots of grazing, so you have tons of erosion coming down, building this fan out through time. This outcrop is a Pleistocene fan that had already been in place. And so what you have through time, and this is based not just on the H model from our geological core work, but studies from across the region, a slow, you initially have this open seaway with tidal influence where you would have had opportunity for tidal agroforestry and permaculture. But as the sea line advances and these different fans, lateral fans from Iran region build out, you eventually have the coast move south. So you're going to lose your influence of tides, and that's going to happen more and more through time. But you also have the closing of the coast and a small embayment, and that really then severs your access to the tides. And the reason why this is important from an anthropological perspective is that as you get that sort of suturing or sort of like pinball levers closing that coastline, and you don't have tidal activity sweeping away sediments as they come down the rivers, those deltas can quickly build out and rapidly. And we think about Sumerian flood literature, and that's a really fun opportunity to explore further with this sort of model. But people had to adjust, and they had to adjust quickly. I'll just give you another cartoonish reconstruction. So based on the data sets that we built out, what's really important here is that in the earliest periods, when you first start to get cities, they would have had access to a rich tidal estuary. You can see where Basra is today. So a lot had changed over, at least from an archaeological perspective, relatively short time scale. And what are the kinds of arguments we can make? Well, based on the settlement record through time, what you find is that you have a lot of, let's say, smaller scale urban settlements evenly divided. We know from the archaeological record, again, people say that democracy began in Greece. No, there's a great paper by a guy called Thorkel Jakobsen about democracy in early Mesopotamia, but you have these really corporate institutions. People are cooperating, sharing labor. We find that in texts. But through time, you have these mega centers rise at the expense of the countryside and these smaller places, and particularly upstream, right? So centers of power move farther and farther upstream. And why might that be the case? Well, that's where you start to be able to rely on control of labor and artificial irrigation at extensive scales because you no longer have access to that tidal zone, right? And so downstream water users become increasingly beholden to upstream centers of power, right? If you want to make the people below you pay, you don't have to use tariffs, you just have to push the water one way or another. All right, and this is one of the last maps that I'll show you here, and that has to, and these are these signs that you see, these symbols on this map, are places where we have evidence for what are called city seals. So earlier, those clay impressions that you saw, seals are these cylindrical objects that you could, they're sealing devices, so you could roll some wet clay across a door or close a container, and you'd know if anybody got into it because it would have to be broken. Well, in this period of sort of environmental challenge, when the deltas are building out and they're losing tidal influence, you see this huge collective undertaking, and some of these seals are associated in some instances with texts, and on those texts, what we understand is that that movement is based out of Uruk, the cult of Inanna, and what they are exchanging are dates and their byproducts, including date palm offshoots. So it's this really interesting example before things do, before, let's say, inequality increases and social challenges increase, a form of community building around date palm agroforestry. And that starts to help us make better sense of why this region in particular, the Gu Eden, was sort of reputed for being so productive. And this is for a different talk, but when we compare the results from Ur, the Euphratic side of the alluvium, to the eastern side of the Tigris, the deltas had built out at different times. The sea extended to the east and to the north of Lagash. So on the western side in the Euphrates, they lost access to the tides before the eastern side had, and so the entire geopolitical scene converged on this region. And we also then see our first, at least textual examples of warfare, the Umma-Lagash border conflict, where Umma recruited cities from the western side of the alluvium and came and ultimately sacked and destroyed the cities here around Lagash. And by the time we get to the end of this period, what we have is textual evidence for increasing agricultural challenges. There's a great science paper from the 1950s called Salt and Silt in Mesopotamia. And we ultimately see the collapse of those Sumerian cities and the movement politically farther north to the region of where today you have Baghdad. So these communities like the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Achaemenids, the Seleucids, the sort of the political center, everything is moving north. And yes, they are relying then on cereals more predominantly, but they also have access and institutions to sort of collectively control that labor force. The big picture here, so here's the Shah of today. This is the same sort of stretch of the river. I said earlier, there's much less fresh water coming down, but I just want to really demonstrate this sense of landscape biodiversity loss, and really this sort of loss of this Eden, right? It's incredible the impacts that land use has had. And it has also obscured, I think, other people from really thinking about how, if this environment had been farther north or closer to the Sumerian heartland in the past, would have really helped to accelerate and sort of undergird those first cities. And so it is a really unfortunate setting. And if you look at the papers, you'll see that cities like Basra are under huge stresses because there is no opportunity for agriculture in the countryside. They're absorbing all of these different populations at a time where you also have increasing heat, poor water quality. You have urban sprawl and with a lot of like slums, and it's a real problem. And I feel like this story, but even the sort of science that goes behind it, is highly applicable to a place like South Carolina. There's the sort of superficial side of things because it's a delta, and in the 1800s, late 1700s was incredibly productive, specifically through the use of tides, right? So this is where we had the epicenter of rice culture. And places like Georgetown and the Santee were highly successful, had the highest export numbers in the world, again, because of the natural opportunity to harness the tides. And there is a bigger story here of how that technology was brought not just from West Africa under these hard enslaved conditions, but that situation had predated that, where during the rise of Islam and the trans-Saharan trade, Islamic slave traders were also bringing communities from West Africa farther east to the Shatt al-Arab Delta in Iraq, where in addition to date palms, they were growing rice, cotton, and some of those same cultigens that they were growing here. But unlike in Mesopotamia, there was a real opportunity to use better historical documents to tie together with the archaeological science, where we can really closely align landscape change and the human dimensions of this agro-ecosystem and how it changed. For example, different hydro periods, how different damming, et cetera, were happening upstream. The interactions of those forces together to help us better understand not just this local scene, but broadly comparatively, other places in the world that harnessed similar tidal systems. And so with that, I'd just like to thank everybody here and happy to take some questions. Yeah.
Is there much evidence for like the Sumerians trading like outside of their like core region, the dates like moving away from that area?
So there's a really cool example. So as you get to about 2400, 2300 BC, you have the rise of Akkad, or the Akkadian Empire. And that's really the first time. So before that, in that Ubaid period, this really early period, there is movement, but it's primarily documented from southern Iraq to the Gulf region, right? Saudi Arabia, the UAE. By the time you get to Akkad, you do start to see movements farther east. And at that same time, the primary state growing center of the world was in a place called Herat in Iran. They have these artisanal groundwaters, and today it's one of the most productive date regions. And there is a lot of, there are these chlorite vessels that are sort of so idiosyncratic to that Herat culture, and it's just starting to flood the Sumerian heartland. And while there hasn't been like residue analysis, for example, what you see on the outside, a lot of those vessels are date bombs, and so they're probably going over there. And so that lines up, maybe I'm making a stretch here, but you would have lost that tidal access. The sort of broader ecosystem certainly would have changed. It would have moved much farther south. But you also have a huge wetland and bayment area that would have prevented a lot of the upstream users to get down there. So this becomes a refugium. Today, they have marsh Arab cultures and the Idan that live there. But historically, this is a place where it was very difficult to control politically because of these wetlands with huge Phragmites. Saddam Hussein drained them in the 90s because he was having such a hard time taking control of that region. And so it seems like, yeah, they shifted maybe farther east.
Yes. Are there other areas around the urban revolution time period across the planet where you also see this agroforestry, maybe even associated with like things that take longer to develop, like date palms?
Yes. So in Mesoamerica, this argument would be made for cacao as a really similar sort of productive cycle. You have not just, let's say, crops in particular, but the systems that you grow to protect crops that do take sort of long-term investments that amortize over time. So you think about terraced agriculture in places like China that is very early on, and going back to the New World, Bolivia, in with Mexico. We were talking a little bit earlier about Chinampa agriculture, these floating systems that require a lot of communal labor, upfront costs, and really do kind of pay off over time. So yes, there are other examples, and we have to think a little bit out of the box. The date palm situation in some ways is very unique, but yeah.
Cool. Yeah, cacao is kind of what I was wondering about.
Yes.
Just because I have no relationship with archaeology at all, I was curious, like, what the environment is like for bringing an idea like this up in archaeology. Like, is it really hard to like convince people of this, or is this an idea that's like more widely accepted now, or is there still like a lot of entrenchment of like more grain-based agricultural like beliefs or views on history?
So, the community that I come from, right? So geoarchaeology, really historical ecology, got its growth in the 70s. And it was really okay to talk about the pushes and pulls of environmental change and its impact on society. And so it came out hot out of the gate. People especially are interested in things like collapse. But as you got to the 80s and you had a sort of big introduction of postmodern thought into anthropology, like you could not talk about this stuff. You would just be, and so that tradition really stayed in Europe, particularly in Germany. And then early aughts came back and it was okay to talk about stuff like that. And then now today, maybe not so much, but it's important, right? Because we all know that the environment matters. It is, people have agency, but like people use a pot or I'm thinking of cultural artifacts, they use the landscape. And so if it's okay to treat objects as sort of these challenges and opportunities, it is certainly okay to talk about the environment. And when you map these places and align them with certain environments and those changes in those environments, there are these tipping points. And so, I hope, one of the challenges though, because archaeologists do borrow a lot from different people, tend not to be experts in any one thing, we know a little bit about a lot of stuff. Need to work with people like you all. And because then you inject a lot more, let's say, legitimacy to some of these arguments. And that is not so new. I was talking about this with Casey a little bit earlier, as academics, we don't necessarily like to reveal our ignorance. But if you're willing to open up and, build out these really diverse teams with different perspectives, different specialties, you can really advance the field and build a brand. And that's one of the things I'm really happy to be here at Clemson to do, because this is a real unique opportunity.
Hey, Dr. Goodman.
I can't get back into this. I locked myself out of the building today. I've done that.